Hey, hello guys, how are you? Hopefully you're having a wonderful day. And today is one of my favorite videos. I'm going to be covering an introduction, a basic small introduction to Aristotle's virtue ethics and the goal of ethics for him. So this is a small introduction, you can say. It's not a big one because I'm not going to really go into depth. Like, for example, I'm not going to go into depth into friendships for Aristotle, like the friendship of virtue and the friendship of pleasure, nor am I going to go into the difference between intemperance and incontinence, nor am I going to go into voluntary and involuntary actions. But I will make videos on that. It's not going to be included because this is meant to be a small introduction. Now let's get started. Now, before I get into what virtue ethics really is about, let's outline some stuff. Now, traditionally or in today's custom, people tend to follow ethical theories like deontology or consequentialist theories. Deontology, it might also be known as a categorical ethical theory, but it's usually just called deontology or Kantian ethics because it's based off of duty and categorical imperatives, right? Now, deontology is Kantian ethics, and this ethics is centered around the categorical imperative. And if you adhere to this ethical theory, you'll likely believe in many of Kant's principles, like Kant's principle of humanity, where you have to treat people as ends and not as means in of themselves, right? Okay, and so Dion just means duty, right? And deology is a duty-based ethics. It focuses on the act and not the consequences. Deontology is a part of normative ethical theories. Now, there is some distinctions within deontology. I think there was first agent order deontology, or if that's what it was called. You can look on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It was a while back, but yeah. And so the motive or intention is the thing we have to focus on here in Kantian philosophy. No consequences. I must act for the right reasons. In deontology, actions are only right if they adhere to a maxim or are in accordance with with certain rules. And I actually have Kant's book here, Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, and one principle or test you can do to see if your action is morally justifiable, Kant says, is that if you can conceive of a world where everybody did the same action you did, and if the world was still working in an orderly fashion, or the world was still okay, then it would be okay. But for example, stealing would not be okay for Kant, because if everybody were to steal, then nobody would have anything, right? And so that's basically Kantian philosophy, and the categorical imperatives are just like this: don't do X, don't do Y. And then the difference between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative, a hypothetical one is just if you want X, you should do Y. So if you want to have a good job, go to college. Now that's debatable, right? Let's not get controversial here. Okay, but moving on. So in contrast, consequentialism looks at the consequences to determine whether an action is good or bad, and consequentialists usually start judging actions right in proportion as they tended to produce happiness and wrong as they tended to produce pain. Consequentialist theories like utilitarianism are viewed as hedonistic. So utilitarianism, right, basic stuff, Bentham, and John Stuart Mill, two proponents of utilitarianism. Very good examples, right? Maximizing utility, right, for the amount, maximizing the amount of pleasure and happiness, right? So basically, basic example I could ever give you of this, you could look at it online. The trolley problem, right? One of the most famous ethical problems. Or you can, there's actually a course online, I think it's called Justice, and they give you a really good introduction to consequentialist theories, in my opinion. So one example they give was, I believe, three men on a boat, on a lifeboat, with one boy, captain boy, and sadly they had to eat him to live because they were out at sea for 24 days. And so consequentialist theories would try to justify that by saying, well, these three men, right, they probably had wives, families. But if you know the full story, the boy didn't have a family, blah, blah, blah. But basically, maximizing the amount of pleasure, saving more lives in sacrifice of one. Basically like that. There are some different utilitarianism though, like rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism, but those are going to get more further deep down, which I'm not going to cover here. Just don't have the time to. This is virtue ethics. Now, how do these two ethical theories differ from Aristotle's ethics or virtue ethics? Well, notice that deontology and consequentialist theories focuses on actions, and they tell us what sorts of actions we ought to do and not do. But virtue ethics differ in the sense that its goal is to have us become good as well, not just identify it. So Aristotle believes that ethics is a branch of political science, right? And ethics is the study of the good for both individuals and communities. Now, for Aristotle, he believes that ethics is an independent discipline and doesn't depend on a general metaphysics. Now, fun fact, if you are religious or Catholic or whatever, but actually no, strictly for Catholics or Christians, if you adhere to Thomism, um, Thomism believes that you can derive morality, you can know morality even without God. Although there are some moral truths that have to be reviewed by God. Now, today online you'll see a lot of people argue that, well, you cannot have morality without a ultimate divine authority. Aristotle refutes this notion because his notion is grounded in a teleological ethics, right? And so I'll elaborate on that in a bit. So Aristotle criticizes Plato since Plato tried to derive morality from metaphysical abstractions, and instead Aristotle thinks we derive morality from practical human concerns. For Aristotle, ethics' purpose is to determine what is good for individuals and communities and to become good. Aristotle identifies the ultimate good for human beings as that which is pursued in of itself, and it is the ultimate goal for all other pursuits. This final good is what makes all other pursuits good in some sense. Now, even if people don't consciously become aware of an idea of some ultimate good, they still are going to act based on assumptions of it. Aristotle believes that all things aim at some good, and that there is some end behind every actions or telos. So his ethics is grounded in telos, action or telos, right? That all things, and this is actually also known as the principle of finality in Thomism, all things act for some end, right? And so, what the heck is his ultimate good? Aristotle's answer is that the ultimate good is eudaimonia, that is human flourishing and happiness. Eudaimonia is living well. And so Aristotle believes that ethics is about living life in accordance with reason. Now, one of the most important thing about virtue ethics is that in defining the good, we need to look at the concept of nature or function, also known as ergon, if I'm pronouncing it right in Greek. Now, Aristotle says a purpose defines what something is, or its nature. That is to say, the function of a knife is to cut. A knife is good if it fulfills its purpose, and if it ceases to cut, it's no longer a knife then. So applying this to humans, the nature of a human being is rationality, right? Because rationality is the differentiate that individuates us from other species like dog, right? So the goal of ethics is not just to understand virtue, but to become virtuous ourselves. So moral philosophy for Aristotle is practical, not just theoretical. Now everyone admits that the goal is, also for Aristotle, you truly cannot learn ethics without having it being practical, right? And now everyone admits that the goal is happiness, and happiness is pursued for its own sake. Aristotle sees eudaimonia, or happiness, as the best life for a human being. Now, Aristotle rejected hedonism, as he believed the life of pure pleasure was incomplete because it did not allow rationality to play a part. This is important because Aristotle's ethic is about living in accord with reason. Why? Because pleasure doesn't complete a human's nature. Pleasure doesn't ultimately fulfill the human's purpose, because a human's purpose or nature is to act rational, right? And so Aristotle also rejects Socrates' moral or ethical intellectualism because Aristotle rejects Socrates' belief that virtue alone suffices for happiness. But Aristotle demonstrates this by saying that external events can disrupt rational activity and happiness can become impossible due to really extreme misfortunes. Although Aristotle still affirms virtue is more valuable than any external good, Aristotle identifies happiness with activity in accord with the best and most complete virtue. Now, scholars say that Aristotle is talking about the life of study, so the best and most complete virtue may refer to intellectual virtue, and Aristotle calls this the contemplative life. Now, I introduced you into one of the most famous doctrines here, Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, which is that virtue is a mean between extremes. Now, do not be confused because this mean is not mathematical, right? You don't do you add up all the things and you divide by the number of the things, right? It's not it's not that, but rather it's about the appropriate balance between excess and deficiency. So, for example, let's take food for example. Aristotle says that it's bad if you indulge too much in food and bad if you indulge too little in food. And so the proper good or virtuous intake is the balance or the mean between the excess and the deficiency. And it's not a mathematical one because it differs from everybody. So I actually will give you the table of virtues. You can also search it up. It's just called Aristotle's Table of Virtues. And you got a bunch of them laid out from the Nicomachean Ethics. Courage, temperance, liberality, magnificence, magnanimity, proper ambition, patience, truthfulness, wittiness, friendliness, modesty, righteous indignation. Some of your books will have different names. Mine has intemperance, right, and incontinence. But obviously, they're just synonyms for them. Now, Aristotle says that a virtuous person is one who takes pleasure in virtuous actions themselves, because a person who finds pleasure in virtuous deeds will naturally do them, and that improves their character. Now, virtue is defined as excellence of character that enables a person to act well in life. Now, if one were to be virtuous or excellent, they should act in accord with reason, which means they must have prudence, because prudence is the intellectual virtue responsible for good deliberation. This virtue is so important because one cannot be virtuous without prudence. Thus, virtue leads to the happy and good life. But note that goodness and happiness are inseparable for Aristotle, right? You cannot have the two separate from each other. And happiness includes external goods as well. A good character, sorry, that's not an external good. I don't know why I put there. But happiness includes external goods. It includes a good character, good health, wealth, friends, etc. Right? And I'm gonna actually make a video on friendship because Aristotle says nobody in of themselves would not desire friends. For everybody desire friendship, right? And I actually recommend you read the Nicomachean Ethics because it's actually such a profound book. And I really think it could really benefit your life. And so I would definitely make videos on this. And if I did not elaborate on the Thomism part about how Aristotle refutes the notion how you cannot have morality without some divine authority, well, it's just simply this. Because Aristotle's ethics is a teleological ethics, meaning that it's looking at ends, meaning that since Aristotle believes that everything aims at for some end, and the end is the good for a thing because, the function is good for a thing. Like a knife is said to be good because it fulfills its function, to cut well, right? Just as a human is good if they live life in accordance with reason. And so that's basically it. So it's grounded in a metaphysical telos. But ethics itself is a independent disciplines because it's concerned with practical concerns of human daily life. And that's basically it. Thanks for watching. And I'll cover stuff like we'll actually go into moral ethical dilemmas. Aristotle actually brings up one, but it's not a modern ethical dilemma, obviously, right? But he gives the example like, oh, what if a tyrant threatens a man to kill his family, but he won't kill his family if the man does a shameful act? And Aristotle says that these actions, they're voluntary in some way, but sometimes they're morally excusable, or the man can't be very much blameworthy because some of these are way beyond what a human can handle, right? But Aristotle also affirms that there are some things, right? Now let's get serious. There are some things that it is better for a man to die and suffer than to commit such an action, right? And if you can ever think of something wicked, that's what Aristotle means, right? That's basically it. Thanks for watching. Peace.